Welcome to Jobber's Gospel Thoughts and more Old Testament. So, the last time I stopped at the story of Saul. Saul, as it said in chapter 16, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and the evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So, the story now shifts to David. And the stories of David and Saul are intertwined in the beginning. So David doesn't become Dawood HaMelech, doesn't become David the king, until Saul has to go through all of these stages of trying to kill David, of trying to get rid of him, and then changing his mind. And we have this confusion in Saul's attitude that I think the writer of 1 Samuel wanted to convey, that Saul was a confused person. He had this evil spirit on him. He had this spirit of confusion in him. So the story now is going to move to David, but Saul is always involved. So we're going to go through stages of David, beloved, David, and then I'm going to do another video segment on David as a fugitive. Then I'm going to do a segment on David the king before we move on to Solomon. But remember, the whole drive of the Old Testament so far, starting with the book of Judges, was to show that the Lord gave all tribes of Israel in the book of Judges a chance at becoming leaders in Israel, and all except the tribe of Judah had honored him. And now there is this Benjaminite, Saul, and he's giving him every chance to change. So David is there. David has already been ordained to be king, but also Saul is still king. And we'll see in the story that David honors that. He doesn't want to get rid of Saul. He really hopes that Saul just preserves him and be a righteous king over Israel. So that's the drive. The drive is to show that David was the worthy king of Israel. And so that's where the cycle of the Old Testament is headed. And Samuel is still alive, so there is still a prophet in Israel. But that's the story. So now we start with chapter 17. If you remember, David had already had the attention of Saul. He's already been anointed by Samuel. Now we have the story of David and Goliath starting in chapter 17. And I'm not going to dwell on the story of David and Goliath because all of us study that to death in our Sunday schools, and we talk about it ad nauseum. We've exhausted all of its cultural possibilities, so I doubt there is anything I can teach here about David and Goliath that you wouldn't know. But here is the thing that always strikes me when I read the story of David and Goliath. David is facing this giant, and the scene, if you remember, starts with the Israeli army, the army of the Israelites standing there, and they're looking at this giant who comes in, who defames them, who cries obscenities against the name of the Lord. And that was a tradition in those wars. You attack the god of the other person, you attack the god of the other tribe. So he's coming at them, and he's attacking them. And David takes on the challenge because, as he says, you come to me with weapons, you come to me with the arm of the flesh, so to speak, and I come to you with the name of the Lord God of hosts. And this has always been an instructive lesson to me, because this is the main theme of the Old Testament: not to put your faith in the arm of the flesh, not to put your faith in armies, not to put your faith in economies, not to put your faith in individual leaders, but to put your faith in God and stay close to God, because God will always lead you to success. So, but here is the thing. Goliath, as the story indicates, he had a problem. He was a giant, and the Jews have all these myths about the giants, how they are descendants of angels who didn't want God to give Torah to the Jews. They objected to it, so God said, okay, I'm going to send angels, And if you remember in Genesis, that story is mentioned. But God sent angels to earth. They took human form, and they just mishandled their agency and created chaos. And they lived for a long, long time because they had the DNA or blood of angels. And so any giant you see in the Bible is in Jewish thought is a descendant of those ancient angels that God sent to the world. And so this Goliath couldn't see well because he sees the sling in David's hands and he thinks it sticks. He says, "Do you think I'm a dog? Do you come to me with sticks?" And the rest of the story is history. David throws the stone in the middle of his forehead. He knows where to throw it and he kills him and then he beheads him, as was the custom in ancient battles. But sometimes the lesson is if we're intimidated by our challenges, if we're intimidated by the people who challenge us, if we're intimidated by their intellect, by their wealth, by their fame, by their status, by all of these things, it will sometimes prevent us from seeing the weakness of their position, the weaknesses in their lives, as opposed to a faithful life. So the lesson to me is not to look at others to say, "Oh wow, this person is having it good for this reason or another, while I obey the Lord and I'm not doing well." The lesson is we need to not be intimidated and just stay focused on the Lord. So that's basically the lesson I learned from the story of David and Goliath. And in verse 55, finally, before Saul didn't pay attention to David. David was just this shepherd, lyre player. He didn't recognize his potential. And again, there is another lesson. Sometimes the greatest of people can be right next to us, but we, as opposed to Goliath, we're not intimidated by them. We think we have very lowly thoughts of them and their potential, and we don't utilize that potential. But now Saul pays attention. So in verse 55, and when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As I saw liveth, O king, I cannot tell." So even Abner didn't know about him. And the king sends inquiries, and as David, in verse 57, as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said unto him, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." So Jesse the Bethlehemite is, to be a Bethlehemite was nothing. It's the lowliest place in Israel, lowliest place in Judah. So he's just this person from a lowly family, and he's just done this great deed. Now, if you remember in my previous episode, I talked about David's name. Davud means to be beloved. So the thrust of the story now is, the theme of the story from now on is to show you how David the beloved is what I call David the loved, how David climbs up the ladder. And so we move on to chapter 18, I believe, and that's the chapter where in the heading here it says Jonathan loves David. So there is this relationship now between Jonathan and David. They are beloved friends to each other, and there is this scene in the beginning of chapter 18 where in verse 3 Jonathan and David make a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And we've all had these kinds of friendships where we love someone so deeply and thoroughly, and we love them as our own soul. But verse 4 is the important one to me because it talks about the robes. Now, if you remember from the story of Saul and Samuel, Saul stripped Samuel's robe as he grabbed onto it to have him forgive him for what he did, and Samuel was very mad because in ancient custom, when you rip someone's robe, the mantle that you're wearing, especially if you're a prophet or a leader, that means your authority is taken away from you. Someone has just taken your authority away from you. Now, the robe here comes in a different form. It's Jonathan giving his robe to David. Robes to this day in Middle Eastern families, especially Bedouin families, are a source of, you give it to the oldest son, you give it to the person who's going to inherit, and it's a sign of a transfer of power, so to speak. And Jonathan gives his robe to David. It's an early acknowledgement that David is the next king of Israel. So Jonathan has an insight here that his father doesn't have yet, but he is about to have. And in verse 7, that's where it starts. That's the famous verse. And the woman, so David is coming back from slaying Philistines again, and the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. So there you go. Saul is not happy about this, and he cast, in verse 11, he tries to actually assassinate David, and David has avoided out of his presence twice. He avoided those assassination attempts, but he's still the king, and David can't deny him. David can't just isolate himself from him. And in verse 14, this is a reminder that keeps repeating all the way to the end of the chapters I'm going to read today. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. David was wise. David behaved wisely. David could have been a fool and tried to take out the king who's trying to assassinate him. His head could have grown and said, oh, all of Israel loves me, Jonathan loves me, I've had the robe, I can become king. But David behaves wisely. David is a loyal person. He keeps his loyalty to Saul, because Saul is the anointed of the Lord. David doesn't probably know yet, or he doesn't know yet about what happened between Saul and Samuel, but he's still loyal, and he would not do it. He would not touch the king. And then in verse 16, again, this theme of love. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So he's coming in and out. What that means is he's going in, he's going out, he's achieving victories, he's being successful. And so we're working now back to Saul's family in verse 20, where Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So that is weird. Why would Saul be pleased that Michal loves this person that Saul is envious of and he hates? So he, in verse 21, it starts a trap. He says, I will give him her that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law and the one of the twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly. So on one hand, he wants him to be his son-in-law, but he's using his daughter as a snare. He basically wants David to do something foolish for the sake of getting married into this family, because Saul can't really assassinate someone the people love so much. They will rebel against him. So he commands the secret communication with David. And again, this theme of love in verse 22, behold, the king hath delight in thee, all his servants love thee, now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake those words in the ears of David, and David said, seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? So David is humble. He still thinks I'm lightly esteemed, despite of everything. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, on this manner spake David. So there is this back and forth. And Saul said, thus shall ye say to David, the king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines. What a weird dowry to ask. So you go, you get me 200, you basically circumcised, dead or alive, 100 Philistines. That's the dowry. To be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Saul thought, no way, no how. David can't do that. They'll kill him and I'll be rid of him. But of course, we know that didn't happen, and David comes back. David comes back with 200 foreskins. And in verse 28, Saul knows, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. So he just became this constant enemy. So there is this jealousy. Success, even if you're loyal, even if you don't intend to have enmity of others, success, strength, being good at what you do can earn you enemies. Usually the incompetent, usually the people who don't appreciate it, or appreciate your efforts, or appreciate your loyalty. It is just the way things roll in this life. If you're successful, you're going to have people who envy you and who will seek to destroy you. And that's the lesson we learn from Saul here. Now, and it's not over yet, because now in chapter 19, we have Saul now in active mode trying to kill David again. And I'm not going to dwell on this chapter other than to say he asks for his servants to go get David, and Michal, his daughter, tells him David is sick. Jonathan sort of changes his mind, but then he changes his mind again and decides to go with the plot to kill David anyway. And David flees. Michal and Jonathan arrange for David to flee, and she puts an image in verse 13. In chapter 19, Michal took an image and laid it in bed. Now, the image is a teraphim. It's in modern translations. In the King James, it says an image, but in modern translations, it's a teraphim. It's an idol. So it shows you also that the house of David, the house of Saul, wasn't 100% with the Lord. His children, Michal at least, had other idols. And this is, as we read the rest of the Old Testament, this is the sin of Israel, the 10 tribes, and then it becomes the sin of Judah, and then the sin of Israel and Judah, and then they get destroyed completely. And this is a whole episode on its own, teraphim and idol worship in ancient Israel. So he escapes, and then in the end of chapter 19, there is again more about robes, because there is this weird scene where he's seeking David. They are looking for him everywhere. He goes to try and find him with Samuel. He suspects that he might be with Samuel the prophet, but the servants can't find him. So Saul himself goes and tries to find David, but then he starts prophesying, and then he tears his own garments. And when the king tears his own garments, that's also another sign that that you're no longer the king. He's prophesying, he's in the presence of Samuel, and he tears his garments, and that's again saying, Saul, you're no longer the king. It's just in the last few days, something similar happened. It's the Lord telling Saul, okay, you need to resign. You need to quit being king. Stop holding on to the kingdom. And he's not listening. He's not listening. He's going to hold on to it until someone kills him later. But it reminds me of the story that happened this week. If you're listening to this in 2022, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, he's been going through one scandal after another for the last 2 or 3 years. Several attempts to have him resign, and several calls on him to resign, and finally, just yesterday, he decided to resign. And this is what's happening with Saul here. Different calls from signs, calls from the Lord: resign, resign, quit, quit, quit. Let someone else take your place. You're not worthy. Samuel tells him that to his face. He still holds on to the kingdom, and he's trying to preserve it by assassinating David. So, but that's the nature of power. You hold on to it, you cling to it, and that's it. Now, chapter 20, again, David and Jonathan renew their covenant of friendship. Saul is still asking for David to come to the Feast of the New Moon, which is a big deal in ancient Israel. It's a big deal in modern Israel. The Sanhedrin, the Beis Din, the house of judgment, the house of judges. They have to meet at the end of every month and try to decide when the new moon is. It's very important to the observance of the feasts in Judaism. It was so then, it is now. And so you have to be ritually pure. You have to be at a certain level of readiness to observe it, to be with the king as it's announced. It's called Rosh Chodesh. And so Saul wants David to be there with him, hoping that he can snare him and kill him right there and then. But David, understanding the situation, has this deal with Jonathan that involves divination. So divination is deep in Semitic cultures. You throw arrows, and if they go right, then you do something. If they go left, you don't do something. So there is this deal with the arrows, and of course the divination proves David right. Saul wants to kill David, and David departs from Jonathan in this scene, very touching scene, two friends departing, and it must have been very horrifying to Jonathan, who knew about David's righteousness and loyalty, yet his father did not appreciate it. And they depart, and starts the new chapter in David's life, David the Fugitive, which is the subject of the next episode. Thank you for watching.